Support for this day in esoteric political history comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is a lot of things. Odoo is award-winning management software. Odoo is total control of your entire company in one place. Odoo is a suite of fully integrated applications for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. Basically, Odoo is what your business needs to succeed. So, if you're ready to get more done in less time, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, business management made simple. Hey everyone, I wanted to let you know that up on our YouTube page, we have a short video with me and Nikki and Kellie reacting to the Donald Trump guilty verdict from this week. Some thoughts on how to place this in history, some other historical moments that are coming to mind as we watch this very big historical moment play out. We're trying to experiment with a little more video here on the show, especially as we watch this election year play out. So you will get to see our faces. You'll get a little analysis and reaction. We had fun doing it. Hopefully you enjoy it. We're trying to build up our YouTube page. So go ahead and track it down and subscribe and let us know if you like it, if you want to see more, so forth. You can search This Day Pod on YouTube. There are also links in the show notes and on our social handles and all that stuff. You will find it. Go check it out. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And welcome everyone to We Refuse Week. Our very own Kellie Carter Jackson has written a new book, and as listeners know, we have one hard and fast rule on this podcast. If you write a book, you get a week. So here we are for We Refuse Week, and I'm just going to get right into it. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt, and most importantly, Kellie Carter Jackson of Wellesley, author of the new book, We Refuse. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
Hello, Nikki.
Hello. Congratulations, Kellie. I got my hard copy a couple of days ago. And it's a beautiful book, which I know we'll talk about, but it's also so good. So I'm excited to chat about it.
I am so hyped. It's like a child is being born. It's like, all writers know, like, how long it takes, all the work and effort you put into a book. It's just a lot. So I'm very happy that it is out in the world for people to read and enjoy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that work and effort. And then I should say, we're going to do 3 episodes, and each one we will pick a sort of specific story that you love from the book. And yes, we will talk about the artwork, and I also want to talk about you recording the audiobook, which is really great. But, I think people know that violence, black resistance is, your
bread and butter.
Your area of expertise, your bread and butter. But, you've written a book, about that, Force and Freedom. Like, how does this kind of build on that? Was there a specific kind of area that you wanted to go to that you felt like built on this thing that you have such a deep expertise in?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's really hard to get away from our expertise. I think a lot of times we wind up sort of, swimming in very similar pools, and then it leads us to other more expansive ideas. So I do see We Refuse as sort of like a continuation of Force and Freedom. I see it as a expansion of the ideas in that book. And I just wanted to look at Black refusal and Black resistance. And I think I got tired of hearing sort of these tropes on Twitter or online about Black people didn't resist, or why didn't Black people all just rebel, or, some really, I think, like harmful ideas about there's a tweet that was like, I am not my ancestors, don't play with me, or something like that. I was like, what does that mean? So this book, I think, really allows us to see that Black people have been resisting and refusing white supremacy from day one, from the moment they were, sort of captured on the shores of Africa up until this present moment. And that looks different all the time. So that when we think about what resistance can be, I think we get caught in these binaries or tropes of like violence or nonviolence, and that's the question the media always poses too. Like, are you going to be violent or are you going to be nonviolent? You're going to forgive your perpetrator? Like we have these very simplistic binaries that don't allow, I think, for us to have an expansive enough array of tools to push back and say, no, that not on my watch. No, this is not going to happen. So each chapter looks at that. I have 5 chapters, and the first chapter is on revolution and how Black people have used revolution. The second chapter is on protection, and I look a lot about like the Underground Railroad and slave resistance. The third chapter is on force, and I look at how Black people have used force, and in particular guns. And the fourth chapter is flight. I look at how when Black people are like, nope, I'm out. And they take their ball and they leave. And I look at things like the Great Migration and just Black travel in general, and how Black people tried to escape really oppressive conditions. And then the final chapter was the most fun to write, which was about joy, and how joy is a weapon, really, and how joy fortifies Black communities and Black people, and it should be a tool that we go to all the time when we're facing difficult moments.
The timing of this feels so on point, because it does feel like in the last 5 or 6 years, there's just been so much debate about what counts as legitimate protest, and the idea that any sort of what's termed violence, even if it's just like property damage, delegitimizes a protest. And there are all of these constraints on like what makes something legitimate. And I realize there's a really long history to that you've been speaking to for quite some time. But I'm curious how much, I know force and freedom had been in the works for years before the rise of Black Lives Matter. But how much did the more recent protests in 2020 play into the ideas behind the book, or the urgency behind this book?
Yeah. I mean, it played everything, because I was not anticipating writing this book. I wrote this book in large part because I was mad. I mean, I looked at the political and social landscape of 2020 and the sense racial retrenchment that has happened in the past couple years. And I was like, you know what? Audre Lorde talks about how like anger is energy, and that you can use that, like anger is information. And so I used that emotion that I had, and I was like, let's put pen to paper. And I just wanted to write something that one would be a love letter to the Black community, that would really, affirm like our identity and our humanity and our citizenship, but also something that would empower people as well, to say like, yes, we do have a lot of options at our disposal, and we don't have to always resort to marches and protests. And that's not to say that marches and protests don't work, but I think we get trapped into thinking that that's the only thing that we have available to us if we want to be heard. And I actually think it's quite the opposite. Like when we think about what is effective, what actually achieves the purpose you set out to do, it's not always that marches and protests achieve that. There are other tools. And so, yeah, it's also a very personal book too. Like it starts out with a story about my grandmother, my great grandmother. Should I tell that story?
Yeah. I mean, let's start to get into some of the specifics. I mean, and we should say, we've each read the book and have some thoughts, but mostly, you're in the driver's seat here. Tell us which stories you want to talk about. Walk us through them, us and the audience. I'm just curious. Yeah.
Sure. I'll tell the story about my great grandmother because it's the opener to the book. It's in the introduction. And really what I tried to do in each chapter is tell like a personal family anecdote right before it. But my great grandmother walked with a limp. And one day I asked my mother why, and she told me that when she was 9 years old, when my great-grandmother was 9 years old, Ernesta, she stepped on a rusty nail. And when she stepped on that rusty nail, it caused infection, which was probably tetanus. They're not quite sure. It was 1915. She lived in rural Alabama. And when the infection set in and it began to spread, it was sure that it was going to be deadly. And so my great-great-grandmother, Mary Bullard, was frantic because Ernesta was not just a child, but her only child. And she did not have proper medical care. So my great-great-grandmother took her to the only doctor she knew, which was this white man who lived on the other side of town in a really big house. And she presented Ernesta and said, "Will you please help my daughter?" And the doctor said, "Sure, I'll help her. But in exchange, she has to live with me and work in my household for the rest of her life."
This is enraging.
And I was stunned.
What year
I was
was
like,
this
she's
again?
9 years old. It's 1915. So we're talking 50 years out of slavery. This is the proposal that the white doctor comes up with. And because my great-great-grandmother was so desperate, and because she believed that Ernesta was going to die, she agreed to the terms. And thankfully, my great-great-great-grandmother, whose name I do not know. All I know is that she is a descendant of slaves, or is that she was formerly enslaved. She refused. And she said, absolutely not. And my mother, as my mother tells me, she picked her up, she took her back home, and she administered every natural remedy at her disposal to heal her granddaughter. And she did. Our Nesta survived, and but the rest of her life, though, she walked with a limp. And I talk about how that story and that condition really is a metaphor for understanding American racism and white supremacy, that oftentimes in the United States, the options are choose a life of social death or refuse and limp. And I think a lot of Black people in America have chosen to refuse this proposal. And it was as a result that they have limped. And that when we think even broader about like sort of like the global people of colonization, like our gait is forever changed by the violence of white supremacy and the violence of colonization. But that doesn't mean that healing and cures are not possible. And so what I'm most focused on is like the remedy, not the doctor, not his proposal, not his not his own racism, but really like, what does it look like to refuse and to create a different path and to say, this is what I'm going to do to heal and save my loved one. And how do we do that for ourselves?
How did this story get told in your family?
Oh, man. So one day, I mean, you know, I'm a historian, so I love history. One day, my mom basically said, like, I'm going to give you guys my family history. I'm in my right mind, and we're just going to take a day, and we're going to do all the family history. It was a lot. All of my sisters, I'm one of 7 children, but all of my sisters came over to my mom's house. We all had food, and my sister got a laptop and sort of like transcribed, and we had recorders set up, and she just started to tell us about her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, all the relatives that we knew about, didn't know about. She knew my dad's family history really well, probably better than my dad. And those histories have just stayed with me. Those stories have stuck with me and really sort of given me, perspective about like what kind of stock I come from, you know?
There's something so beautiful about that particular story of passing along family history because, as you know well, like so much of this history goes unwritten. So much of it has to be treated as speculative because there are so many silences in the archives. And so the ability not only of your mom to recognize, we got to pass this along, for your sister to transcribe it and for you to have that record, but then for you to take that record and make it sort of the backbone of this book about Black refusal, that transformation into the official historical record has to feel kind of awesome.
Feels good.
Yeah.
It does. I gave my mom a copy of the book, and she cried. She read it in one day, and she highlighted. She's rereading it again because my mom's also a professor, and I was like, "How did you read it that fast?" She's like, "This is what I do for a living." Like, but it does feel very good. And I think the lesson in that story is sort of like, you know, when we come back to this idea of, are you going to be violent or are you going to be nonviolent? You know, what I think about my ancestor, she didn't try to morally persuade the doctor. Mm-hmm. You know, she didn't try to say, she's a child, she's 9, please. She didn't beg, you know, she was like, give me my granddaughter. Like, and she didn't also like try to kill the doctor either. Like, how could you, you know, like attack him or, you know, something like that, plot against him. She didn't choose that sort of nonviolent or violent path or the metaphorical fork in the road. She really carved out her own organic concoctions to save her daughter. And that grit is what sustained her. And it's so funny now because I look at pictures of my great-grandmother And I don't see the limp. You can't see it in an image, but the pictures that I have of her are like of her sitting on my grandfather's lap, smiling while my grandfather's like smoking a cigarette. Like we have all these pictures of her in the garden when my mom was like 5 or 6 years old. It's like these really happy, joy-filled pictures. And I think part of that is recognizing that that's not her entire story. Stepping on the rusty nail was not the end for her, that her life was so much bigger than that. And that's what I want people to take away too.
I mean, the other thing that didn't happen was there wasn't sort of an appeal to the law or any sort of like higher structure, right? Which I feel like is a big part of the book and a lot of the stories that you tell, which is, as these sort of larger structural fights are going on day to day on the ground, people have to just find ways.
And the law would not have helped her. I mean, certainly not in Alabama in 1915 for a little black girl. She would have been seen as expendable. And it could have caused additional violence to her family to try to put the doctor in a position of harm or of indictment. So, they knew that was not going to be on their side. They knew that they had to, solve this themselves as best as they could. And so each chapter, each story really talks about how Black people have used either protection or force or flight or revolution or all of these different ways and remedies, as I see them, to address oppression and address the violence of white supremacy.
It's so fascinating the way that law kind of sits as almost to the side in a lot of these conversations, right? Because the law is as oppressive as that doctor was. And for a lot of people, they learn about Jim Crow as a series of laws and a series of restrictions. And by bringing these stories to the surface, these stories of resistance, we get to see something that's different from that. Like it takes place kind of not even really in conversation with those laws, but it's instead centered around a set of values and non-negotiables and how people, once they have their non-negotiables, figure out a path forward.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the law, it's so interesting how like race reinforces the law and vice versa, and how we see this play out not just in the story of my great-grandmother, but there's another story I tell about my great-grandfather and how when he was also living in rural Mississippi, because all of my family is from the South, he had 18 children. So they had a huge, like massive family, and they all worked on the farm. They were all pretty much sharecroppers, but they had good reputations. They were sort of beloved in the community in which they lived in. And one day my grandfather, James, was out driving and he hit and struck a white child and killed the child with his car instantly. And it was completely an accident. The child, he didn't see the child ran in front of the car. And when my mother told me this story, I was like, oh, that's it. Like, and this is how grandpa died. Like, that's what I thought she was going to tell me, because I never met my great grandfather. And she said, no, it was a miracle. It was miraculous. I was like, what happened? She said, word spread around town that like, no, it was an accident. James is okay. Like, don't harm him. Don't harm his family. Even the family of the boy was defensive of my grandfather. And I could not for the life of me understand how something like that happened. And then I looked back and I started thinking about the moment in which this took place, which is in the 1930s, and sort of on the rise of the Great Migration, where Black laborers and Southerners are leaving in droves. And I think the town looked at my grandfather, looked at all of his children and all of these, laborers and workers, and said, we cannot afford to lose, 16, 18 Black people. If we harm him, if they leave, if we exile them, these are valuable workers. And so in this case, the little white boy's life is now expendable. He shouldn't have gotten in the way. And I think about that, how even in the face of outside of white supremacy, in the face of capitalism, white lives are also expendable. If they get in that cog in that wheel, then all bets are off. And so it really does look at how white supremacy and capitalism can harm all of us. It can make all of us expendable. And the protection that we get is not for our own benefit. The protection is to keep exploited labor in the system.
That story reminds me of something that I feel like I've learned on the show a lot from the two of you. But, you know, it's just such an important reminder that, like, the specific conditions on the ground and the social dynamics and the relationships, especially when we're talking a lot about small towns, small groups of people. And so you have to look at the big structural things, but you also just have to understand, you know, these are folks who know each other, will have to keep living with each other in some way going forward. And that, how does that affect their decision making? That's how most of us operate, right? We don't necessarily refract our day-to-day behavior through big structures. We think about the sort of small community of people around
You don't
us.
consult with neoliberalism every time you make a decision.
Right, exactly.
No, and if you're, you know, Black Southerners like my family, you know, churchgoers, everything was religious, everything was spiritual, and this was a miracle, and, you know, that was the story.
Yeah. So we're going to do a couple more episodes, and you're going to kind of take us through some of the other chapters and themes and stories here, and we also, I want to talk about the artwork, and I want to talk about recording the audiobook. But Nikki, you know, you sort of at the beginning of the episode said that the timing of this is really incredible because we're having this conversation in the wake of 2020 about violence, nonviolence, and how that really shouldn't just be a binary, or that's very complicated spectrum in between those two. I thought you were going to say it's great timing because, you know, we have this salient example in very recent memory of one form of resistance is when you decide to jump into the water at a marina and swim across to another dock and get out and punch a racist in the face, or hit them over the head with a chair. Save
that. That's in the book too. We'll cover
I know, exactly. So to tease, you write about that. Incredible timing. I know you watched that boat riot in Montgomery play out and said, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I wanted to am writing about. So we will talk about that story in a couple episodes. Incredible moment. But we will leave it there. Once again, congratulations on the new book, We Refuse. Out now. Everyone can go get it. Links in everywhere. Links in our show notes, links in our newsletter, all that stuff. But Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avergan. We'll see you soon. Hey, it's Jody. Did you know that Radiotopia has a reality dating podcast? It is called Hang Up, and it's kind of like a queer cross between The Bachelor and Love is Blind. Each week, the star goes on phone dates with the callers, and then one caller is eliminated week by week. They do not see each other. Here's a taste of Hang Up.
Our star Timo is 41 years old and recently divorced.
I haven't been on a single date in 18 months.
But now, they're looking for someone special.
And like, really hot sex. Really hot public sex.
So we set them up with 6 callers to date exclusively over the phone.
I feel like I could talk to you for hours.
Now, at the end of all this, the last caller standing can choose the star back as their soulmate and go on an all-expenses-paid vacation together, or choose a cash prize instead. Hang Up is hosted by Zakiya Gibbons, one of my favorite people at Radiotopia, and not for nothing, the artwork for this new season is incredible. So, check it all out. It is like nothing else being done in podcasting right now. Season 2 of Hang Up, out now on your favorite podcast platform.
Radiotopia.